Okay, I'm doing this video for Nelissa because she was asking me about how to discern, how do we count down basically to God's Sabbaths. So I'm doing this video because I've done videos in the past as I was discerning this, but I went through a lot of, I took you with me on my discernment process. And so some of my mistakes are in there. I mean, my whole process is in there. So now that I have understanding, I think that it's important just to keep revisiting these things and summarizing what God has taught. So I think it's good timing to do this video. So what we're going to be talking about is, how do we know when God's Sabbath is? New moon in biblical times was defined by the crescent moon, and common sense will just kind of tell you that, right? You don't look into the darkness and say, oh, this is something new. You see the light show up, and that's the new moon. So where NASA came up with, the dark moon being the new moon, I don't know. But it's actually well established that during biblical times, and this is why, I'm guessing this is why, Muslims actually look for the crescent. The problem with that is that the crescent can come up at any time. It can become visible at any time. And so we actually have in Scripture the crowing of the rooster to help indicate when the new moon is coming up. Now, if you live in a rural area, that might be a little bit easier to determine with a rooster. If you live in the city, it's going to be difficult because roosters don't just react to natural light, they also react to synthetic light. So car lights, street lights. And boy, oh boy, if I were your neighbor, I would really ask you not to get a rooster in the city or the suburbs, because that rooster is going to crow at everything, and they're built for it. So roosters are very sensitive to light, and this helps us to understand when is the sun coming up, when is the moon coming up. This would have helped those working the land, which was everyone. That was everyone's livelihood, was working the land. It would have helped them to determine different times of the day and also different times of the month. Now, there are some who claim that the full moon, I've seen this theory, that the full moon is actually the new moon. That doesn't make much sense in terms of common sense, but I will say one thing. If we are determining in Scripture that the crow of the rooster, and actually let's establish that in Scripture. Let's establish that right now, because I think that's important instead of anybody just taking things, at face value that I say. Job 38:36 says, who gives the ibis wisdom or gives the rooster understanding? So there's certain understanding that the rooster has. In Matthew 26:34, Jesus says, truly I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Now, the rooster, that was on the 15th of the month. We know that because that was on the 14th of the month. So that was coming close to the full moon. Now, as the full moon is coming up, the rooster is going to crow more. So we know that it was the 14th of the month because that's the night of Passover. If the full moon began the month, then you would have been somewhere around the dark moon right there, so the rooster wouldn't be crowing. Okay, so that's like a basic fact. The rooster's not going to crow when there's no moon, but the rooster is going to crow more when there's a full moon. Just based on the cycle of the moon, there would have been a dark moon right there, because there would have been the full moon as they're identifying new moon to be full moon. Okay, so then you count down, and as you're counting down those 14 days, the moon is waning again, all the way down to a dark moon. Okay, so that throws that out the window. That's just based on common sense. Then there's this statement in Mark 13:35 where it says, therefore keep watch, because you do not know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or at dawn. So the rooster crowing is being set in reference to periods of time. Let me read it again. Keep watch, because you do not know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or at dawn. And it's being set in reference to light coming up. Evening, midnight, when the rooster crows, or at dawn. So the rooster crows just before dawn. I gotta tell you, there is not a library or a bookstore that is large enough to give me the understanding that God has given me. I mean, how could I even understand this, you guys? How could it have even occurred to me that the rooster had something to do with this? But God is the one who bestows this understanding. If you're studying new moon or you're studying a month, rooster is not something that comes into your mind, is it? But God led me there. Discern the fruit, guys. If you're discerning whether what I say is true, whether I'm from him, discern the fruit. Let the fruit testify. Take that fruit and bring it back to God and ask him, all right, this is the fruit that she's bearing. Is she from you? Don't try to make that decision on your own. Go to him, because it really is just right that you would go to him and discern that first with him. That's you putting God before man. But I do have to say, I do have to say, I did not get this from myself. I did not get this from a library. I did not get this from a degree or some formal education or university. I got this from God. Because that's what God's doing at this point in history. He is restoring his calendar. But he's restoring it to people who care. If you don't care and you're comfy with your Saturday and Sunday Sabbath, then, go do you, as they say in the world. But just know that you're prostituting yourselves to the Romans. And that, whatever so-called Sabbath you're observing is not going to be to your credit. As Paul says, there's only one gospel that's going to save. Otherwise, you believed in vain. Okay, so we've established that the rooster is a source that God has established in order to help us to understand when the light is coming up. Now, in that context of Mark, why does he not say then, whether in the evening or when the rooster crows or at midnight or when the rooster crows or at dawn? How come he doesn't say it twice? Because there are some nights where the rooster isn't going to crow because there's no light coming up. Just as I demonstrated to you, when there's no moon, when the moon is dark, the rooster is not going to crow because there's nothing he's crowing at. This is the reason why this is written this way. Okay, so we've established that the full moon theory, not so much. The new moon is when the moon is made new. It says it right there. And if there was any question about that, God would have just made it clear, wouldn't he? If he wanted something else, some other kind of understanding, he would have just made it clear. But we understand that the new moon is when the moon is new. All right, so that moon can become visible at any time of the day. So God has a 30-day month. We know this from Genesis 7 and Genesis 8, in which he says that the flood waters started on the 17th of the second month all the way to the 17th of the seventh month. So we know that that's 5 months. And then Genesis says that it was a total of 150 days. All right, 150 days divided by 5, that makes it 30 days in each month. Not a bunch of 28, 29, 30, and 31 day months, but 30-day months. In Revelation 11, it says that the witnesses are testifying for 1,260 days. And in Daniel 12, it defines that to be a time times and half a time. That's 3.5 years. So we know that there are 30 days in God's month, but these are 30 God days. And what I mean by that is that when the new moon comes up, that's going to kick out the previous day. And when it comes up, it's going to start the new day. So you could technically have the last day of the month being less than 24 hours, and you could have the first day of the month also being less than 24 hours. And it just so happens that the cycle of the moon is 29.5 days, as we have been defining a 24-hour day. But the 24-hour day did not come from God. God never defined a day to be 24 hours. He defined a month to be from new moon until just before new moon. He said that that was 30 days. And he has separated the light from the darkness, and he talks about days in terms of separation of light from the darkness. But he has also said that when the new moon comes up, that's a new day. So that means that you have a previous day that could be cut short of 24 hours, and you have the next day that could also be short of 24 hours. And somewhere along the way, it's going to have to happen like that. Because according to what we define to be 24 hours, there are only 29.5 days in a lunar cycle. Now, I've counted this down. I've mapped it out. I have done all the hard work of mapping out 30-day cycles. 30-day cycles could never work according to what we're calling a 30-day cycle. And the reason why is because eventually you end up not starting the month by the new moon. You're going to end up further and further into the moon cycle. But the moon, as God talks about in the Psalms, he says it's the faithful witness in the sky. Okay, so that's Psalm 89:37. It will be established forever, like the moon, the faithful witness in the sky. And of course, he's talking about his line, Jesus's line, his church. And I think that's really interesting because in Revelation 12, the moon, which represents Israel, is under the feet of this woman, Zion. But let's not get too far down that rabbit hole. I just want to point out to you that the moon is described as the faithful witness in the sky. And the reason I want to point that out to you is because as I was going through discerning this, and I was so frustrated because I was, not understanding this, and then I would think, okay, I understand it, and then there was something else would come in, and it was just such a long and arduous process of days and days of trying to discern this. But one thing that God did tell me at one point, because I had started to go down a different road, and God said, no, the moon is the faithful witness in the sky, so keep going back to that. And actually, it was with regard to when I was plotting out the 30 days, and then I was like, but 30 days and winds us up in this way, Lord, and then we're starting the month with the full moon or a different phase of the moon. And that's where he had repeated that to me. Remember that it all begins with the moon, with the new moon starting the month. Okay, so I want you to remember that because that was an important piece of wisdom that he gave to me. Now, one thing that I want to tell you is, I think that a lot of times when we're looking at these things, it's so foreign to us that we're like, this is impossible. How could this be true? And, whatever. And it's because we have prostituted ourselves to the Romans for so long that we're so accustomed to this relentless set of 7-day weeks to Sunday through Saturday. We're so accustomed to that. And so that's become normative to us. But if we had just been doing what God had established, that would be normative to us. So you have to remember that, sometimes you're going to have to be a little uncomfortable and feel a little ambiguity and strip yourselves, unlearn everything that you think you know. That was one of the first things that God said to me. Now, I want to remind you that in Hosea, and I'm trying to remember where else, God tells us, he warns us that he is going to remove our Sabbaths, our holy days, and our new moons. Okay, so Hosea 2:11, I will stop all her celebrations, her yearly festivals, her new moons, her Sabbath days, all her appointed festivals. Here it is. I was looking for it in in the Psalms, but it's actually in Lamentations. Lamentations 2:6, and he hath violently taken away his tabernacle as if it were of a garden. He hath destroyed his places of assembly. The Lord has caused the solemn feasts and Sabbaths to be forgotten in Zion, and hath despised in the indignation of his anger the king and the priest. So this was already prophesied. You have to know that. The fact that you were born during this time, or born into a time in which those Sabbaths and feasts had been forgotten and removed, is just what it is, guys. We're actually really blessed. I mean, my parents are not here anymore, and I'm sure that my parents would have, well, I don't know, actually. I don't know if they loved truth enough, but, it makes me sad that they weren't here during a time when truth was being restored. I hope that they have a chance in the second resurrection, but they won't make it to the first. I know that. So it's clear in Scripture that there is a time of which God speaks, and I think it's a pretty long time, in which people were not regarding God's Sabbaths or his holy days as holy, and God removed them. They weren't important to them. But then you see in the temple, in the third temple of Ezekiel, which we are the third temple, by the way, you see that those Sabbaths and holy days are reinstituted, and so are the new moons. We're blessed to be living during a time when God is reestablishing truth and reestablishing his Sabbaths and his holy days and his new moons. So remember that when you start feeling frustrated and you got to work a little bit and you got to unlearn everything you think you know and you got to sit with the ambiguity, remember that you're being given an opportunity that my parents weren't given, that many generations, in fact, were not given. And then you make a decision as to whether you really want truth, because truth isn't always easy to come by. And in fact, I've found that it's not easy at all, especially when everything in this world is fighting against it. And so you might have to do a lot of validating with God, in God, to remind yourself that these things are in fact true, because the world is going to tell you the opposite. All right, so we know that the rooster has something to do with helping us to identify when the light is coming up. We know that there are 30 days in God's month, and we know that in Amos 8:5 that it says God is rebuking the people, and he's saying that they keep saying, when will the new moon be over that we may sell grain? What does that tell you right there? For some reason, they're not selling grain on the new moon. And then he says, and the Sabbath be ended that we may market wheat. So he has set up the new moon with the Sabbath as being a day of rest. He's not setting the new moon up as a 7-day Sabbath, because it's not a 7-day Sabbath, but it is a day of rest. It is a Sabbath, but it's not a 7-day Sabbath. So let me read the full context. When will the new moon be over, that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath be ended, that we may market wheat, skimping on the measure, boosting the price, and cheating with dishonest scales? Okay, I had really, it wasn't even a conversation, because this person was so worked up about this. She didn't want to have to do any more than what she's certain she had to do, which is really a heart issue. And what she was arguing is that God was rebuking them for wanting to go back and cheat each other. But that's not what the passage says. The passage clearly indicates that the new moon is a day of rest, that the Sabbath is a day of rest, or he wouldn't have said, when will the new moon be over that we may sell grain? For some reason, they were not able to sell grain on the new moon. That's just a basic fact right there. All right, so if the first day of the month is a rest day, but is not a 7-day Sabbath, I'm going to demonstrate to you that this is not a 7-day Sabbath. The first day of the month is a rest day. You might need to get out a calendar and write down day of rest or work day or whatever. Write down R for rest and W for work. Okay, 30-day month, first day is a rest day. Then you got 6 work days. How do we know that? Because we started out with a day of rest. 6 work days, day of rest. That's going to go on for 4 weeks. So go ahead and mark that out on your calendar, your W's and R's. That brings you to the 29th day as being the last 7-day Sabbath of the month. So actually, there's only 4 weeks in a month, and they are cushioned in a regular month. We're not talking about holy day months, because that gets a little bit more cumbersome, and I'll talk about it in a minute. In a standard month, you're always going to have, the first day is going to be a day of rest, followed by 4 consecutive weeks, and then the 30th day of the month is going to be a work day, guys. And it's going to start over with the exact same pattern. First day is a day of rest, followed by 4 weeks, followed by a day of work, and then you start all over and do it again and again and again. Now, the reason I say that this is in a standard month is because if you have a month like Pentecost, where you're told that you are observing Pentecost on the day after the Sabbath, and Pentecost itself, or Feast of Weeks, is also a Sabbath, that's going to throw things off. And Pentecost always lands on the 16th of God's month. Remember that God's days are numbered in his month. There are no names to his days. On the 16th of the month is always going to be Pentecost. So that means that your days of work are going to change, right? Because typically you would have the 15th being a 7-day Sabbath, and then the 16th would normally be a day of work. But if this is another day of rest, that pushes your week forward. So that means that you're going to be observing the 30th as a Sabbath. And then, of course, the first will always be a day of rest. The faithful witness in the sky is always going to restart things. That's what's always going to get you right back on track. So in Leviticus 23, God says that you are to count down 7 weeks up to the 50th day. Does that seem like a kind of peculiar way to state that? Seems kind of weird, right? To count down 7 weeks up to the 50th day. Why didn't he just say count up to the 50th day if this was a matter of just counting down days? This is the reason why. Because if you have 2 days in between those weeks, then you're actually not counting just 50 days. You're counting 7 weeks and then adding a day from the offering of first fruits. I say this because it's more proof to you guys that what we have been observing is totally incorrect. So to answer your question, Nelissa, about how to determine when God's Sabbaths are, you're going to start with the new moon, the crescent. Whenever the crescent comes up, you're going to know that that is a rest day, followed by 6 work days, followed by a rest day, followed by 6 work days, a rest day, 6 work days, a rest. And you're going to do that for 4 weeks. And then the last day is going to be a work day, except for, like I said, when there's holy days, and I give you the example of Pentecost. I think actually the month in which Pentecost occurs is the only month where the 30th ends up being a rest day. I'm pretty sure. Just going by memory on that. Now, what this means is that at the end of the month, you're going to have the 29th being a 7-day Sabbath, or the 30th in the month in which you're observing Pentecost. And then your first day of the month is going to come pretty quickly, right? It's either going to be the 29th, and then you're going to have a day of work and then a day of rest again, or it's going to be the 30th and then the day after, which is the 1st. Remember again that this is not referring to a Gregorian calendar. This is referring to God's calendar. When I'm counting 1 through 30, that is set in reference to the new moon, not a Gregorian calendar. So that means that you're going to have these days of rest, a Sabbath and the new moon, are going to be really close together. And then you're going to have 4 weeks where they're separated by 7 days. And then you're going to have, again, the last Sabbath and the first day of the new moon are going to be close together again. So you're going to have days of rest that are pretty close together. Now, I want to remind you that we have an assembly that meets online, not in a counterfeit church. We're all observing this. It is a difficult thing to be alone doing this, and you're not designed for it. You've been told to assemble. You've been told to assemble even more as the day approaches. You're not designed to take what I say and then go off and do your own thing. What you are supposed to be doing is discerning, is what I'm saying true? And so anyone who enters our assembly, and we've essentially come up with this more recently in the last several months because this rule that everyone who enters the assembly needs to do a fast first and discern if this is where they're supposed to be. And I'm going to tell you why. Because we have had a lot of people come and go and just bring total, utter chaos. And that's not what we're about. So our point of discernment, you should be discerning whether you should be with us, and we should be discerning whether you should be with us. That's all of our responsibility. And if you think about it, like, I understand that sounds like a big rule, but people in the Word were discerning whether people should be with them. We're discerning based on, have you returned to God or not? And if you're not willing to do that, then we're not willing to have you come in and be disruptive, because that's ultimately what's going to happen, is that people will come in and they'll be disruptive and they'll make it about them and they'll, treat it like a therapy group or something like that. No, that's not what's going to happen. If you want to be with us, you need to return to God so that we can then, then you're going to be appropriate. And you'll be coming to actually worship God instead of bringing a bunch of counterfeit Christian, practices with you. I don't mean to say that in a way to say, like, we don't want you with us. I really don't mean that. But we've just dealt with a lot of stuff that's jarring. And we need to be protective of God's house. And so anyone who comes needs to discern, and we need to discern them based on whether they're willing to do the fast. And also, by the way, every single one of us has done multiple fasts. We fast on a regular basis. And so if we're willing to do that, then everyone else should be willing to do that. And in biblical times, people were in a regular habit of fasting. Okay, so that's how you count down the Sabbaths. Again, remember that you are commanded to assemble on Sabbath, on new moons, on holy days. And if you're not doing that, you're not in line with what God has commanded. If you are coming from a Seventh-day Adventist church on which everything is hinged on this belief that all you got to do is observe God's right Sabbath, you need to know that the covenant is far bigger than that. There's a lot more involved in your covenant than just observing the right Sabbath. And the ironic thing is, Seventh-day Adventists, they talk about the Catholic Church all the time. They prostitute themselves to her. Where did Saturday come from? If God's days are numbered, then where did Saturday or Sunday or any of these other days come from? They came from their harlot mother, who has prostituted herself to the world, and anyone who's prostituting themselves to her and continuing in her practices of Christmas, the cross, Easter, tithing, Sunday, Saturday, Sabbath, anyone who's doing that is a daughter of their mother. Please discern the things that I'm saying with God.